Good morning, everyone. A special good morning to people who might have been up all night watching elections. My name is Stacie Goddard, and I am the Paula Phillips Bernstein Faculty Director of the Albright Institute. And we are so excited to have with us today Mr. David Miliband from the International Rescue Committee, having a conversation that will title From Impunity to Accountability, Rebuilding the Global Compact. We're going to start with a talk by Mr. Miliband before moving into a moderated session with me, and then into the Q&A session, but we can start accepting questions whenever. So now I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to President Paula Johnson of Wellesley College to welcome our speaker. President Johnson.
Thank you, Professor Goddard. Good morning, students, faculty, staff, alumni, and other friends from our community, and to all those who are joining us today for this virtual event. A special welcome to our Albright Fellows and Albright Ambassadors. This is the opening keynote lecture of our Albright Institute for Global Affairs January program, now in its 11th year, and what a year it is. This year's theme is rebuilding global institutions, and it could not be more timely. The pandemic, now raging around the world, drives home the fact that this century's most urgent problems can only be addressed through global cooperation. What we do in these next months and years will shape the course of history. And I would say that today is particularly important as we witness democracy in action in the United States, ordinary people changing the course of history. And so today we are truly fortunate and honored to hear from David Miliband, an extraordinary leader and advocate for vulnerable people. Mr. Miliband's topic is global politics in what he calls an age of impunity, a phrase that cuts to the heart of the world's greatest challenges. His insights grow out of what has been truly a remarkable career. David Miliband is currently the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees the agency's relief and development operations in more than 30 countries, its refugee resettlement and assistance programs throughout the United States, and advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. and other capitals. From 2007 to 2010, he served as the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, the youngest in 3 decades, representing the United Kingdom throughout the world. Previously, he served as Secretary of State for the Environment and a member of Parliament. In 2006, while Secretary of State for the Environment, Mr. Miliband pioneered the world's first legally binding emissions reduction requirements. His first book, titled Rescue: Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time, was published by TED Books in 2017, and his TED Talk is fast approaching 1.5 million views. A graduate of Oxford University, Mr. Miliband received a first-class honors degree in philosophy, politics, and economics in 1987. 2 years later, he received a master's degree in political science from MIT, which he attended as a Kennedy Scholar. Yet, impressive as this resume is, it's far from the whole story. What makes Mr. Miliband so extraordinary is not simply what he has accomplished, it's also why and how he's gone about it. The son of Jewish immigrants who fled Nazi Germany, fled Nazi Europe, by the way, Mr. Miliband's work is deeply grounded in personal convictions. His perspective is a moral one, both values and solution-driven. This is evident in an October op-ed published in The Guardian, where he observed that 25 years after Hillary Clinton famously proclaimed that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, that women and girls caught up in conflict are more vulnerable than ever, a fact too often obscured by missing data. He called for women and girls to be counted in gender disaggregated statistics across a range of measures. Such an important step. It also comes through loud and clear in his TED Talk, where he talked about the refugee crisis as a test of our character, as much about us and who we are as it is a trial of the refugees on the front lines. Powerful words. Following Mr. Miliband's talk today, he will join Albright faculty director, Professor Stacie Goddard, for a moderated conversation. I can't think of a better pairing. As many of you know, Professor Goddard is Wellesley's Mildred Lane Kemper Professor of Political Science, and her research engages with core issues in international security. She is the author of When Right Makes Might, Rising Powers and the World Order, published by Cornell University Press in 2018, and Indivisible Territory and the Politics of Legitimacy, Jerusalem and Northern Ireland, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. Professor Goddard is also the visionary faculty leader of this program, and I want to take this opportunity to thank her and her team for the amazing job they've done in taking the Albright session virtual. I am in awe and so very grateful. The next hour will be fascinating, and I'm quite certain it will be. And I am so pleased to give you Mr. David Miliband.
Well, President Johnson, thank you very much. You make me blush, and the truth is that the honor is mine for being here today and joining the extraordinary Wellesley community. I know that you haven't yet produced an American president, but I'm sure it's a matter of time before you do. And I'm really pleased to engage in what I hope will be a genuine conversation and dialogue. I'm looking forward. Professor Goddard, as you say, is extraordinarily distinguished, and I'm sure that her questions will be really probing and interesting, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. I've been asked to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I think 15 minutes is probably the outer limit of Zoom lecture tolerance, certainly a lecture delivered by me. What I want to do is touch on the humanitarian situation around the world, but then try and make a point to you about what I call the coming, or the dangerous coming, of an age of impunity. So just let me start with my day job, which is to be the proud leader of the International Rescue Committee, founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to rescue Jews from occupied Europe. The first employee was in occupied France in 1940. People like Marc Chagall were given fake passports by the IRC and helped to escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. Today, we work in about 40 countries around the world, as well as working in refugee resettlement in the US. We're unusual amongst NGOs in that we have a focus. We're focused on people whose lives are shattered by conflict, persecution, and disaster. And we work across the arc of crisis, from the war zone of Syria, or conflict in Afghanistan or Ethiopia, through to internally displaced people, refugees in neighboring states, on transit routes, and then refugee resettlement and integration in places like the US and Germany. I want to give you a sense of the work that we have underway, or the work that's done by 13,000 employees and 17,000 daily paid volunteers around the world, by just referring you to the emergency watch list, the 2021 emergency watch list that we have just published. It lists the 20 countries where we fear humanitarian crisis is going to get worse in the next year. These 20 countries represent 10% of the world's population, but 80%, more than 80% of the world's humanitarian needs, 88% of the world's internally displaced, 84% of the world's refugees. These are states whose humanitarian crisis is driven by three factors. By conflict. It's remarkable today that there are more extreme poor in Nigeria than in India. But conflict is the #1 driver of extreme poverty around the world today. By climate change, which is a force multiplier, crisis multiplier, and by COVID. Just to give you an indication, #1 rating, which is not a welcome rating, goes to Yemen, population 24 million, 18 million, 19 million people in humanitarian need, the threat of famine, war piled on the shortage of water, and COVID on top. More people have been displaced by war and persecution. Our client base is bigger than at any time since World War II. 80 million people, more than 1% of the world's population. About 35 million of those people have crossed borders as refugees or asylum seekers, and 45 million are internally displaced. Within Syria, for example, population 23 million in 2011, 6 million now out of the country as refugees in places like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Germany, but also 7 million internally displaced. And the war continues in the northwest and the northeast, where about 800 IRC staff are working. So that's the crisis picture that we respond to, and I'm very happy in the Q&A to talk about the work we do. But I wanted to pick out something geopolitical for this audience to talk about today, and that's what I call the coming age of impunity, or the danger of an age of impunity. One aspect of the displacement crisis, the 80 million people, is the virulence and duration of civil conflict, uncivil conflict that goes on. Not wars between states, but wars within states. In Syria, the ratio of those displaced to those killed is 25 to 1. And that contrasts with a post-Second World War average for all civil conflicts of 5 to 1. So the amount of displacement per death is rising in the Syria conflict, and we see that elsewhere. And one aspect of the virulence of the conflict, and one aspect of the increased levels of displacement for conflict, is the growth of impunity. Impunity is the abuse of power up to and including war crimes. It is the bombing of a coachload of 43 children in northern Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition, which includes the US and the UK, I'm afraid. The US from before the Trump administration is worth pointing out. Also the bombing of IRC health centers in northwest Syria, a point I'll come back to. Now, obviously, impunity is not new in war. There was no golden age in which accountability reigned. But after the Second World War, the post-Second World War state settlement did try to establish force behind the Geneva principles. It tried to turn them from a voluntary code into a legally binding set of instruments. The International Criminal Court, which was established in the 1990s, tried to go further. What's called the responsibility to protect, the idea that if a state wasn't protecting its own citizens or was attacking its own citizens, then the international community had a responsibility towards those citizens, was agreed by 190 countries in the UN in 2005, and tried to establish a basis for balancing the rights of states with the rights of citizens. And humanitarian interventions in Sierra Leone and Kosovo in the late 90s seemed to promise a more activist global response after the inertia over Rwanda and Bosnia. And I'm sure that the Albright Center has heard Madeleine Albright reflecting on the lessons of the 90s, traumatic lessons in all sorts of ways. She's an extraordinary and inspirational figure. And one of the reasons I was attracted to doing this talk and this conversation is obviously to honor Madeleine, who I was in touch with yesterday and is really an inspirational figure. She didn't cross over with my time as Foreign Secretary, but I took her lessons before I took the job to make sure that I didn't go too far wrong, or at least learned lessons that she had to teach. But the truth is that that wave of concern and commitment to assert and defend the rights of civilians caught up in war has been poisoned in various ways over the last 15 years. It's been poisoned by the failures in Iraq and in Libya. The financial crisis of 2008 drained popular support in the West for activist foreign policy. The rise of non-state actors, first of all Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, has raised questions as yet unanswered about how they are held to account for honoring and respecting the rights of citizens and civilians caught up in war. And the result of this, these shifts, this retreat of liberal democratic countries from commitments to humanitarian intervention, the rise, as I'll come on to talk about, of non-state actors, has made impunity more the norm than the exception in the places that we work. The laws and norms of war are in retreat. Just let me give you the figures for 2019-20. An average of 34,000 civilians being killed every year in conflict, more than double the level 5 years ago. I think I'm right in saying 70% of all deaths in war are now civilian. An average of 120 aid workers killed every year. We suffered the loss of one of our own aid workers in Ethiopia just before Christmas, more than double the level 15 years ago. Health facilities in particular under attack. I think this is extraordinary. 1,000 attacks every year. This is premeditated attacks on health facilities and on health workers. In Syria alone, 900 medical workers have been killed by airstrikes since the war started. All the more shameful given the pandemic, doubly, triply shameful given that the coordinates of those health centers are supplied to all combatants in the war. And ethnic cleansing seemingly on the rise. Freedom House, the NGO, counts 11 countries committing ethnic cleansing, including China against the Uyghurs and Myanmar against the Rohingya. 3 countries 15 years ago. And impunity, therefore, has become more normal. That's my point to you. Conflict is more urban, so civilians are more in the firing line. There is more remote targeting rather than deployment of troops, which anesthetizes, I think, decision makers from the human cost of their decisions, and more regional actors getting involved in civil conflicts. The counter movement, which is a world of greater transparency, of citizen journalism, of activist NGOs, of the ability to post globally instantly, of global media connections, that counter movement has not been strong enough to hold conflict actors to account. And here's the point I want to make to you. The impunity that my colleagues and I are seeing in war zones where we work is part of a wider shift in the world that is also seeing the rise of impunity. I presumably don't need to tell this audience that democratic government is in retreat in some surprising places. Over 100 countries have seen reduction in political freedom in the last 15 years. And what we're seeing in the United States is the most serious challenge to its democratic legitimacy, certainly in 150 years and maybe since the foundation of the Republic. Democratic governments around the world are setting a bad example. President Trump, in respect to the electoral system, in respect of his attacks on the judiciary or the media. I'm sorry to say, Prime Minister Johnson in his proroguing of Parliament last year, President Erdogan in locking up journalists. So it's not just that authoritarian governments are becoming less, quote unquote, liberal. It's that democratic governments or democratic countries are becoming less liberal as well. Liberal not in the American sense of left versus right, but liberal in the sense of respecting human rights and individual rights. There's impunity in the economic realm as well, also not new. There's an interesting PhD thesis about economic impunity, 1690 to 1720, that I read the abstract of and had a chance to talk to the author, Trevor Jackson, about. But symptoms of economic impunity abound, from tax havens, from the rise of tax havens to the decline of antitrust to the pay explosion at the very top of the economic private sector ladder. And social media, what sometimes should be called anti-social media, both abounds with examples of impunity, because impunity is about power without responsibility, lies without answer on social stroke anti-social media, hatred without counter. This also fuels impunity through the anonymity of social media, through its distance, through its toxification of public debate. So I think that this notion of a contest between impunity and accountability is an important way of framing global political choices at the moment. And I thought I'd just conclude my opening remarks with some thoughts about how, in the areas where we work on the global scene, in the conflict zones of the world, how could can the new administration coming in to office on January the 20th, how could it be part of, how could it lead a counter movement to impunity? I've sort of thought that while the Obama administration had an atrocities prevention board, and there were mixed lessons of that. I've been wondering what would an impunity prevention board do in the US government? I mean, one, it would get its own house in order. The DHS would follow international law at the southern border and allowing asylum seekers their rights to claim asylum and to have their claims fairly adjudicated. The Defense Department would take seriously the need to tackle impunity in war zones, in conflict zones where it's working, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. Secondly, a new administration would rally other countries against impunity, using the UN and other fora. President Macron, in his UN speech the year before last, 2019, he spoke about the age of impunity. And there is a role for a coalition of states to reaffirm Geneva principles and live by them. Thirdly, a new administration would have found a way to engage with international justice. I understand, sadly, that the International Criminal Court is more controversial in America than it is in European countries that I know well. But I think there must be a way for a new administration to find a way to engage with the agenda of international justice, if not by supporting the ICC, then by other means. For example, the way the German government has supported independent assessment of President Assad's war crimes by NGOs in Germany. Fourthly, a new administration, I think, could engage the arms industry and make arms sales conditional on tests of internal repression and external aggression. When I was Secretary of State in the UK, all arms sales had to go through a vetting process that the arms were not going to be used for internal repression or external aggression. And that was challengeable in court at any time. I think that's a good thing. I think a new administration could encourage the arms industry and the finance industry, which supports it, to come together against the use of their products for killing civilians. So I think there are a range of ways in which, in the realm of conflict, the reassertion of the laws of war, the norms of war, the protection of civilians, could become a part of the suite of diplomatic measures of the new administration. Let me finish on the following note. Writers like Robert Kagan and Adam Gopnik has taken my generation and sort of shaken us by our metaphorical lapels. They've argued that liberal democracy is not the natural state of affairs, which is like people like me, desperately old now, but who in the early 1990s were told that liberal democracy was the natural state of affairs, even the end of history. Robert Kagan says that the quote-unquote jungle of unbalanced power, which has been the motif of human history, grows back if it's not pruned. And Adam Gopnik, whose book, 1,000 Small Sanities, I just read, he says the following, quote, "Strongman politics and bossman rule in its simplest form is the story of mankind." Apologies for the strong man, mankind. That's what he says in the book. The real question is not what makes it happen, but what, for brief periods of historical time, has kept it from happening. In other words, these authors are saying, don't be so surprised by impunity. Be surprised by accountability and commit yourself to trying to build it. And my view is that this need to build accountability, to build what John Kenneth Galbraith in 1952 called countervailing power, is the foreign policy test for the modern age. Can we build countervailing power to the rise of impunity at international level? I think we can. I think we must. And it's my hope that that's what the new administration will help lead in the future. So President Johnson, Professor Goddard, thank you very much for giving me this platform. I hope I haven't exhausted my time limit in a really terrible way and fallen into the old politician's trick or old politician's habit of speaking for too long, but I'm really looking forward to what I think will be the most interesting part of our time together, which is the conversation, and so very much look forward to it.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely certain right now that there is applause that we cannot hear over Zoom. And just a reminder to the people that we can't hear over Zoom, we're going to go till about 9:40 with the conversation just kind of up here, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So do feel free to use the Q&A function to begin to submit your questions. One nice thing about Zoom is that as you're talking, I can scroll down questions without people seeing, because you said so much that was really thought-provoking. And I really want to start with this question of impunity, but also accountability, because that's really where you ended up, was how is the international community, and in particular states that adhere to liberal values, going to hold actors accountable for these actions. And I want to ask you about that, because obviously we've seen this in refugees crisis in conflicts like Syria, in Yemen. For people who are paying attention, the conflict in Ethiopia has already generated close to 60,000 refugees out of Ethiopia and Sudan, and that's likely to get worse as well. you are really making the argument that the international community needs to do more, but there is quite a bit of resistance. So the story of Syria, for example, isn't just simply a failure to act. It's a story of resistance from states like Russia and China that make arguments that to intervene is to violate sovereignty. So how is it that you can actually overcome that type of resistance to accountability without actually causing a significant amount of escalation with these type of great powers?
Look, it's a great question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it in a soundbite, but just at two levels. One, the sovereignty case, I think, needs to be engaged. I mean, as a naive young foreign secretary, went to Shanghai in 2008 and gave a speech about how Bob Zellick was right to talk about China needing to be a responsible stakeholder, but it also needed to understand what responsible sovereignty meant. And of course, the Chinese system privileges above all the doctrine of banning external interference in internal affairs, but in the name of sovereignty. And my argument is that we have to be ready to recognize that in an interdependent world, the sharing of sovereignty as well as the exercise of sovereignty is a fundamental part of good governance. And we have to understand that. And obviously, that is an argument that I'm losing at the moment. I mean, Brexit is a prime example of losing that argument rather than winning that argument. So I don't want to seem naive, but I think there's a whole argumentation there about what does responsible sovereignty mean? What are the limits on it? When are there triggers for its for overcoming it? And interestingly enough, the Chinese government are now in a position where climate change is an international responsibility, not just a national responsibility. And so there are issues of sovereignty that are raised in that domain too. Now then, secondly, at a practical level, I think that the only way to think about pushing back against those who want to say, no, impunity is okay if it's done by a sovereign government, is countervailing power. And the truth is that successive administrations around the world have not wanted to put their chips onto the table in respect of the Syria conflict. It's been too complicated, too complex, too marginal. And those chips aren't just military chips, but the cost to the Russian regime, to take that as an example, of their intervention in the internal affairs of Syria has been very low. I mean, the international community has not made them pay for war crimes which have been documented by the UN. I mean, a UN inspection of the bombing of hospitals very clearly fingered who was responsible for it, but there's been no sanction as a result of it. And so I think that I don't want to seem simplistic about it, but unless you're willing to impose costs, then you can't create a balance of power. And that's why I think the notion of countervailing power to impunity is very important. You've got to put in the minds of those who are taking the decisions to bomb my ambulances, my organization's ambulances, that they might be held accountable for it. And that's why I think the notion of impunity, if you look up the dictionary definition of impunity, it's a decision without consequence for the person who's taking it. And that's, I think, where in the end we have to get to. And I don't want to pretend it's simple, but at the moment, the costs are close to zero.
So pushing you on this a little further, what are the mechanisms? What's the platform that can be used, right? Because if
well,
we take,
I gave some. I mean, that's a very. You're absolutely right to push on it. Some of those are governmental, and government. I mean, first of all, you have to take away the hypocrisy. If the US is part of a coalition that's committing war crimes, it's not in a very strong position to counter them. If the US is separating children from their parents at the southern border, it's not very good. It's not in a very good position. I mean, the liberation of Raqqa from ISIS, if you look at some of the tactics that we use there, raises some pretty profound issues. So you've got to live by the principles. But then secondly, you've got to be willing to put chips on the table intergovernmentally to pressure those states that are engaging in criminality and the abuse of power. Thirdly, I do think civil society has a really important role in this. The support of Syrian civil society and the documentation of Assad's war crimes, just to take that example, is really important. Then international institutions really matter. So UN fora, but also other fora. And that's why I raised the International Criminal Court, which I know has huge controversy in the US, but which is an actually existing institution that is meant to be holding accountable. It was set up with the precise job of holding accountability. Fifthly, I think there is a role for the private sector in this. And that's why I mentioned the arms industry and the financial industry that supports it. And one of the, I'm sorry to fall into the old politician's habit of referring you to my previous speeches, but anyone who's interested, there is the World Economic Forum at Davos last January, a year ago. I made a speech all about this. But I think that there is a private sector role. And one of the arguments I made is that in the end, the abuse of rights doesn't stop with the abuse of civilians' rights. It ends up abusing property rights as well. And the whole Jack Ma situation at the moment is kind of an interesting example of that. The idea that you can be economically free but politically repressive, well, let's see how far that goes. So look, I don't want to pretend that that's an encyclopedic or in any way a full answer, but those are the kind of things I think could make a difference.
Let me hone in just for a second on the idea of international institutions, right? Because you said in your book, Rescue, that international institutions are at their weakest moment right now than they've been since their creation at World War II, right? And so what we can think about that kind of almost the heyday of the 90s and the creation of the ICC, the coming of the responsibility to protect after that. And yet it really seems in the last few years, what we've seen is a struggle of the United Nations Security Council to act, a struggle of the ICC to be able to do anything effective in Syria. Are there mechanisms that you see? Are you optimistic about the ability to reform international institutions so they can be effective, so they can actually create accountability?
Well, look, I'm a sort of optimistic person, so I mean, I'll probably dodge that part of the question. But here's an answer. First of all, I mean, I'm not quite sure what bit of the book you're referring to, but so I mean, obviously there are some institutions that didn't exist. So one can't say, the ICC didn't exist until the late 90s. So it's a bit. What I have said is that there are the international institutions that are weakest point since the end of the Cold War, and that our current situation of what Ian Bremmer calls a leaderless world, a sort of global vacuum, is in a way more dangerous than the Cold War. I mean, obviously we don't face the threat of nuclear annihilation, but there was a sort of organized basis for the period 1945, 1950 to 1990, in that you had two superpowers rallying coalitions for them. You had a non-aligned movement. You could see, you knew who to call. We're now in a situation of disorganized sort of vacuum, and that creates extra danger, I think. Now, the second part of the question, I think that if you're thinking, how does the international system rebuild itself, you start with COVID, because the vacuum of international leadership, the weakness, the political and financial weakness of the WHO is a problem for all of us. And so if you're asking me, how does someone like me, if your question is, how can someone like you, where do you see the place to start in rebuilding this a new kind of international architecture that isn't biased towards the powers that were strong in 1945, that does include the emerging world in different ways, that does reform. I wouldn't start with trying to reform the UN Security Council, because nothing's going to happen. I would start with COVID, and I'm serving on something called the International Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response, so I have to be slightly careful on what I say. They've asked us to be careful, but I've said publicly, look, let's use COVID to think about what an adequately functioning global health security system would actually look like in the modern world, given that we have a screaming global emergency that calls for effective international coordination as well as local action. Obviously, if states in the US tell their citizens not to bother to wear masks, the pandemic's going to run out of control. But we also need a global system that functions better, and that functions better on the preparedness and on the response. And this is not going to be the last pandemic. So for those of us who are trying to think about how is it possible to think of redesigning the international system, I would start with global health, where there's an obvious grounds for China and America, to take two examples, to actually work together rather than work separately.
So I'm going to take this moment. We're coming on 9:40 to invite a couple of our Albright Fellows from this year's class to ask questions. So Lizette Ortega and Anna Mervosh, if you could unmute. And
sorry,
Lizette,
but my answer is probably too long. So
no.
I will try
Anna,
and
actually, since you're here, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask a question?
Hello, my name is Anna Mirvash. I'm a junior and an Albright Fellow this year. Thank you so much for being here today. This was so interesting to hear about your work. My question for you revolves around climate change. How does the IRC work to protect climate refugees around the world? And how do you expect the organization's work will change based on the events of the climate crisis in coming
Thanks,
year?
Anna. Nice to meet you. And thanks for a good question. The first thing is, I hope this isn't rude, but I don't use the phrase climate refugees. And let me just say why. Because a refugee is someone who flees their country because it's not safe to stay at home. And the evidence so far is that there are many more climate IDPs, climate internally displaced, than there are climate refugees. So there was a drought in Syria, in northwest Syria. Where did the Syrians go? They went into the cities in Syria. They didn't cross into Lebanon in the main in 2008 to 10. In Bangladesh, a country very exposed to climate crisis and rising sea levels, people migrate from the southern part of Bangladesh to northern Bangladesh or to the rest of Bangladesh. They don't necessarily go into India. So just my first point is not trying to be kind of a pedant. We've got to be careful about what we're talking about. But secondly, you're right that climate is a driver, indirectly as well as directly, of the refugee crisis. So climate change causes resource stress causes conflict causes refugee flows. And so climate isn't the monocausal driver of a refugee crisis, but it might be a secondary contributor to a refugee crisis. And it's for that reason that as we did our strategic plan last year, we rewrote our mission statement explicitly to call out the climate crisis as a driver, albeit indirectly, of humanitarian crisis. And the Watchlist example that I gave you makes that point. Thirdly, we're going to have to, we are adapt, we're living with climate change in the places that we work. And so our economic livelihoods programs, we are trying to reform or renew them to make sure that we're helping pastoralist communities, farming communities that we're supporting cope with climate change. And so that's, I think, a very prime example of how our programming needs to change. Final point, I would love to see the global humanitarian community and the global climate community working much more closely together, because issues of climate are issues of justice, and issues of justice require issues of climate, and they come together, and the two different sectors haven't done a great job of working together. So that's what I'd like to see us doing more of. Hope that answers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lizette.
Hi, Mr. Miliband. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Lizette. I'm a junior at Wellesley. And I wanted to ask, inspired by your 2017 TED Talk, where you emphasize our duties to strangers and the personal responsibility we all have in the refugee crisis, I want to ask what you have found are effective ways to humanize refugees in the public eye and present the refugee crisis as the urgent issue that it is.
Thanks, Lizette. That's a great question. And the nice thing is I can give you, I love lists, as you've probably already discovered. I like saying 2 points, 3 points. I'm just going to give you 1 point in answer to your question, which is that it's a very simple one, but I believe it passionately. The best advocates for refugees are refugees. I mean, the biggest thing we could do is to get our own clients talking. Now, sometimes it's dangerous for them to talk. Someone's got to think about that. But honestly, they can do 1,000 times better job than me, because what they convey to the global community is, oh my God, it could be me, because it might be a fitness instructor from Damascus. It might be a farmer from South Sudan. It might be a dentist in Ethiopia. I mean, it could be anyone. And them telling their stories is by far the most powerful way. Now, it's been surprisingly hard to get funding for, you've got to take some investment to do that. But I hope we're getting more and more to the stage where if you click on rescue.org, which is the IRC website, you'll see more and more of less and less of me talking and more of our clients talking, because I think that's really the most powerful way to get across the message.
Okay, so I'm going to start reading off some of the questions that are coming in from our audience, and I do encourage everyone to keep submitting questions, and I will get to as many as I can. The next one actually comes from one of our current fellows, who I believe you might actually be meeting afterwards, and she was curious about how it is, or whether your own experience as Foreign Secretary, as well as in Parliament, how you carry that experience into your work in a non-governmental organization.
Well, I think that there's no reason for me to deny, well, the only reason I would deny that I'm bringing to my work is that some people would say, well, politics and humanitarianism mustn't mix. That the whole point about the humanitarian enterprise is that it's independent, neutral, impartial, and is about humanity, and politics, no one thinks it's independent, partial, or neutral. And I don't find that very useful, really. I mean, we bear witness to war crimes, and that's politics. That's the failure of politics, but it's also politics.
Mm-hmm.
And we bring values to bear that I think can cross partisan lines. We should never be partisan political. But the way I would answer your question is to say that as Foreign Secretary, as a Secretary of State, you're looking from one end of the telescope, and the great advantage is you can see the big picture. The great danger is that you lose sight of the people. Now, if you're running an NGO, it's the opposite. You're looking from the opposite end of the telescope. The great advantage is you can see the people. The great danger is that you lose sight of the forest, that you lose sight of the wood for the trees, and that you can't see the big picture. And what I would like people to say when, after I'm gone from being the head of the IRC is, yes, he helped us look from both ends of the telescope. And that's what I said I would do when I applied for the job. Is one reason why the job's interesting is that it almost meets in the middle of the telescope. We've got the humanitarian perspective from one end, we've got the political perspective on the other, and then at the meeting point, we can get close to the line of politics and of policy and humanitarian. And we can deal with the symptoms, but we can also speak to the causes. And that's what I like to try and do. I also think that politics, I think, does teach you things about listening. An unexpected thing to say. I mean, the best politicians are actually good listeners, and they find other people's ideas, and they find ways of renewing themselves. I think politics teaches you about multiple stakeholders. You've got your electorate, you've got your colleagues, you've got your departments you're running, you've got the international stakeholders and partners that you have if you're in foreign policy. So I think politics is. I think politics is an extraordinary calling and service, and I hope your students go into politics. I mean, it's a brutal business in various ways, but it's a great thing to be involved with. And so I don't go in for this thing of talking down politics. I mean, some politicians act in a venal way, but most people go into politics for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. Even if they don't agree with me, even if they're not on my side of politics, they're going into it for the right reasons. And so I'd really try and encourage people. And I think that we shouldn't, as citizens, we shouldn't be afraid of politics. We should be engaging with it.
Let me take another question from our audience, and this is actually from one of Albright's former fellows, Esther M. How do we balance the growing reliance on unilateral, multilateral sanctions, which arguably try to get to the issue of addressing impunity, with the kind of constraints those sanctions can actually then put on NGOs and humanitarian actions, right? So are there moments at which those can actually come into conflict, I think is what Esther is asking.
I'm not quite sure how. I mean, I think that trying to, 96% of our staff are local people. I mean, they're serving their own community, and so trying to anything which, for our Ethiopian colleagues today, I mean, anything which produces jaw rather than war is a big and good thing, and so I suppose that, I mean, maybe you could make the argument sanctions against a country that make it poor, it could have an impact down the line or produce a reaction. So one would have to think about that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, sadly, we find that too much military strategy is done without cognizance of the effects on civilians generally, not just on NGOs. And so maybe I'm not getting the best point of the question, but I think that it's not a good argument to say that we should put up with impunity because the reaction to trying to challenge it might be negative.
So let me take a question here from one of our fellows, Sasha Blackman, who asked if there was a moment in which your perspective profoundly changed, or you learned something while working on the ground at the International Rescue Committee. Is there something that an assumption that you came in about working with refugees or in conflict zones that changed during
Oh,
your
I think all the time. I mean, I didn't come into it completely green, but I mean, all the time you're learning. I mean, all the time you're learning about, look, for this audience, it's pretty, I sat outside Goma in Democratic Republic of Congo with 40 women in a sort of hut, really, where our teams, we do a lot of work on gender equality, gender inequality. And so obviously, the first question I asked was, are these 40 women okay? These were 40 clients of ours. And the first question I asked is, are you okay to talk to me? And they said, yeah, we want to talk to you. And the secretary of the local group that we'd helped to set up said to me, we didn't know rape was a crime until we met the IRC workers. You don't forget when people say that. Maybe that's not what people were expecting me to say when they said, does it challenge your preconceptions? But it challenges your assumptions about what's a common vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So that's one way that you learn. I think that there's learning about the changing nature of conflict. When you go to El Salvador and you understand about the way the gang conflict is working, you think, well, we've not just moved from a different model of interstate to intrastate conflict, but the nature of conflict within states has changed. So that's a big learning. I think that the other thing is there's an image of refugees in refugee camps, but actually 60% of refugees are not in camps, they're in urban areas. And there's an image of refugees as the poor, which is true, but if you meet Syrian refugees, they're middle class. So I think that there's a lot of way. I mean, it's been a hell of a year, obviously, and so the learning is much more restricted. But the other thing is, people say, well, how do you remain hopeful running an organization when so much is going disastrously wrong? And I always say the gap between humanitarian need and humanitarian provision is growing. And the answer is that the people you meet are bloody amazing. I mean, the clients that you meet, I mean, and if they remain hopeful, if not for themselves and for their children, what right do we have to be pessimistic? So that's another learning. So I'd try and answer the question in a very broad way rather than a narrow way.
So let me, I'm going to take, since we're beginning to run out of time, it's an amalgam of questions. And it goes back actually to something you said about politics and politicians and really seeing that as a fruitful field. But at the same time, and I've seen you speak about this as well, there has been quite a bit of, how do I put this, the turn towards populist nationalism. And with that, the resistance to refugees, right? That's created in many ways kind of a reactionary movement against many of the issues that you work so hard on. So how do you begin to think about engaging those people, right? If you think that part about being able to address these crises is bringing people to the table, right? Even people that you disagree with politically, how do you go about that?
Well, I mean, if I had a really good answer to that, I'd be, then
Speak slowly and let us take notes.
But look, I think one's got to unpack a bit. First of all, 66% of Americans didn't want to allow Jews to come to America in the 1930s. So let's remember, this isn't the idea that some people don't like foreigners is not a new. It's not I said to my team at the end of last year, there's this expression, "not invented here" syndrome. And I said to my team, do you have that in America? Not invented here syndrome. Have you heard of that?
Not yet.
Yeah. So I said to my team, look, beware the invented here syndrome, which is the idea that because we think of it, it's the first time anyone's thought of it. Mm-hmm. So first thing, let's have a bit of historical perspective on this. Secondly, that means being clear that post-truth politics, what's called post-truth politics, isn't new. But it's got new power. It's being powered in new ways. Anti-social media is powering post-truth politics in ways that it's not that there's never been lies before, but lies are able to get their boots on and get halfway around the world so much quicker than ever before. And look, we're finding that about this anti-vax craziness, the anti-vaccine stuff, you know, COVID is an invention. I mean, fighting post-truth politics is something we do in our work because it gets in the way of health provision. So the second thing is understanding what's distinctive about the modern situation. Thirdly, I think you've got to come back to the answer I gave before. The best way of humanizing refugees is for refugees to talk as human beings. And so, yes, we should treat those who disagree with us with respect, and we should go to places that try to, where there's argument. We're not just talking in our own echo chamber, not just preaching to the choir, but we've got to remember who are the voices with credibility are those who say, well, I am from Iraq and I did serve the American military and now I'm an American and I'm a productive and patriotic American for the following reasons, because this country actually does care about protecting the vulnerable. And I was vulnerable because I was targeted by death squads because I'd worked for your government. You know, that's so much more powerful than me giving the theory or the statistics. Now, there is a bigger point, though, which I think is right, which is this democratic recession in democratic countries. That's and that's separate from the refugee issue. I think that's a bigger, and that's partly the rise of impunity, but it's a bigger thing. And I'm not a democracy theorist, but I do think that the frustrations at the way representative government works and the failures to deliver, exemplified in the financial crisis and elsewhere, are really serious drains on public confidence. And it's not universal. You know, Mrs. Merkel in a consensual system is more popular than ever, and she's been in for 16 years. But I do think that there's a unpacking to be done of how critique of government has led to poisoning of the system in the eyes of voters. And that's something where I think there's an awful lot of humility that people like me have to offer, because I think it's very dangerous, but I'm not sure what the answer is.
So we have a few minutes left, and I'm not only going to take the moderator's prerogative, I'm going to try to end us on an optimistic note, because you talked about, well, during your talk in the Q&A, you talked about COVID in some ways, obviously, being a curse, but in many ways also presenting some sort of opportunity for reform in the international system. You're head of the CEO, you're CEO of the IRC. You can make change. If you were given a magic wand, what type of change would you make immediately? How would you exploit the opportunity of COVID-19 to make the world a better place for refugees?
Yeah, I mean, just let me add something to my, or let me answer that by saying, look, you were hinting in your question, does crisis create opportunity, in this sort of now cliched Chinese proverb? And I think it's important, relating to the last answer, if you look at the University of Gothenburg, they have something called the Varieties of Democracy Project. And it's studying democratic advance and regression over the last 120 years. And they've studied 170 countries since 1900. And they've diagnosed what they call a third wave of autocratization. It's not a very nice word. You probably know that. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You're a professor of politics, so you must know this better than I do. But here's the point. They also diagnose more global popular mobilization in defense of democratic rights, or in advance of to advance democratic rights, than ever before, which is kind of an interesting. The repression, or the repression of journalists or of NGOs or of civil society or of judges, produces a counter reaction, which is kind of interesting, and is the eddy against the flow that in a connected world there are people who are wanting to assert their rights, not have them taken away. And so I think that human history is clearly made of bounce back. It's not that the Whig theory of history that there was a simple, that's why it's not very popular to say this, but that expression which President Obama liked a lot, or likes a lot, that the arc of history is long but it bends towards justice. I tell my teams, look, no, that's not right. That's the Whig theory of history, that everything's going to be better. No, the arc of history of justice is long, but it can be bent towards justice, and it's our job to do so. And the danger of saying the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice, it somehow seems like a natural, organic thing. Whereas my point is, it's all about struggle, it's all about fight, it's all about effort. And that means that I guess the magic wand question about COVID is to see the right lesson from it. And the right lesson is that we're an interdependent world, we're a hyper-connected world. And if we don't manage the global commons properly, we're all going to suffer. And using health as the example of saying we're not safe anywhere until we're safe everywhere, it's going to mutate everywhere unless you tackle it everywhere. That means vaccine and it means global public health. That requires a governmental solution, a public mobilization solution, and a private sector solution. It's what Pascal Lamy calls a plurilateral response, not just a multilateral response. And so my magic wand would be to say, boom, people realize it wouldn't be one policy, it would be a realization of our interdependence. And that's not a new idea, but I think it's the most fundamental idea.
Well, we are at time. I want to thank David Miliband for this incredible conversation and for taking the time to join us today. I want to thank President Paula Johnson for giving the introduction. And I especially want to thank everyone in the audience, our fellows from people outside of the community, for joining us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.